Hello, my name is David, and today I'll be covering how I created Rise of the Decayed, the third film in my SAURIA animated series. I'll be covering everything, like how I go from these early drawings to my fully finished characters. I'll be going over all of my artwork, my animation work, my inspirations, and even some of the backstory and lore I have written out to complement the larger world of SAURIA. Please enjoy. I love horror. Horror films, the history of horror cinema, horror games, horror stories, and while I feel horror elements show up a lot in my artwork and animations, rarely do I get the chance to create a straight-up horror film. But with Rise of the Decayed, that's exactly what I set out to do. Many different things inspired me to create this film, but I think the works of H.P. Lovecraft definitely had the biggest influence. H.P. Lovecraft, for those of you who don't know, was an American author who created the Cthulhu mythos. Lovecraftian horror, the subgenre he coined, is often referred to as the horror of the unknown, or cosmic horror. His stories often featured ancient and unseen cosmic gods, monsters, and forbidden knowledge, forbidden truths that, once known, changed the characters' minds, their perceptions of their reality, driving them to total madness. His stories often feature a single narrating protagonist, recounting the events of the story to the reader as if writing a journal or a letter. This single exposition-spouting monologuing character would, over the course of the story, be driven to insanity as things get darker and more twisted.
I know of the gods they call upon now.
That's why Rise of the Decayed is written the way it is, with Ornithocera being pretty much the only speaking character, monologuing directly to a silent audience as he is slowly possessed.
This is its game. And after what I have seen, I am truly sorry.
Approximately 5,000 years ago, the forefathers all mysteriously disappeared. They were a once great and powerful empire, an intellectual race of scientists and scholars. They once managed to conquer the whole of SAURIA. And now, in the absolute darkest corners of the world, a sickness is festering. Some call them the Dark Ones, others the Decayed, but most call them the Fell. Creatures that skulk in the night. They kidnap unsuspecting travellers, slaughter livestock, the stuff of scary fairy tale. But these twisted and feral things, almost never seen, are not myth. In fact, these feral things are somehow the last surviving echoes of the mighty forefathers. That was the small snippet of lore I wrote out for the Fell before I started to sketch out my designs. I immediately knew I wanted the Fell and the forefathers to look like pterosaurs. SAURIA is just as much inspired by modern paleoart as it is vintage paleoart. I chose pterosaurs specifically because the group has had such a dramatic change in public and scientific perception over the decades that I felt fit the contrast between the forefathers and the Fell really, really well. Modern pterosaur paleoart depicts these animals as noble and strong and competent masters of their domain, just like the forefathers, while in the past, pterosaurs were depicted as squawking, monstrous and leathery vermin, just like the Fel. It really didn't take me very long to settle on the type of look I wanted for these monsters, and in fact, once I got to this drawing here, I felt more than comfortable 3D modelling and texturing the character models. I love these guys. I've always loved, like, the creepy, hunched and feral monster type characters, and honestly, I think getting the chance to design monsters like these, bringing them to life, getting them to move and to scream and to skulk is probably the most fun I have making these animated short films. As for all of the Fel-possessed animals we see in the film, there's a crocodile, a stegosaurus, and some Litzowiczia, but I think the star really is the Spinosaurus. I came up with this idea while working on Rise of the Decayed that this Spinosaurus was a serious challenge for these Fel cultists to subdue and curse. The scars and spears and restraints littering the animal's hide hint to this. They paint a picture of just how much of a struggle it was for the Fel to battle and restrain such a powerful, wild animal.
We should never have taken this path.
The film also has a bunch of returning SAURIA dinosaurs as well, like the Parasaurolophus and the Therizinosaurus, but the Stegosaurus, the Allosaurus, and the blinking you'll miss it Nemicolopterus featured in the film were actually not made for SAURIA. They were all instead models I made for scrapped Dinosauria series films years ago. I actually have tons of fully rigged and textured dinosaur models for films I never made that often never see the light of day, so it was really nice to finally show these three off to you guys in some way. Speaking of character models created for other films, I need to talk about these Pachycephalosaurus looking dudes. I actually added this short scene last minute into Rise of the Decayed, but this race of oppressed peasant farmers living under Blue Song rule were originally going to be the stars of the fourth film in the SAURIA series. The fourth film was going to centre around a particularly young individual, as he finds his grandfather's old armour and discovers his family were once noble knights, and his people were not always living under the shadow of an uncaring empire. They were once proud, independent, and strong. I won't spoil too much because I think I might still make this film, possibly, but more on that later. The Fel are dangerous but killable feral monsters. The great elder ones they worship are unkillable eldritch gods. The transcended ones are somewhere in between. Locking in a definitive design for an unknowable Lovecraftian entity almost defeats the purpose. These things are supposed to be formless and unimaginable. So the big bads, the great elder ones, we don't ever see. What we do see in the film is a transcended one. These things are not quite gods themselves. They were in fact once mortal saurians that were so deeply corrupted by magic that they have transcended into Lovecraftian demigods. My first real design attempts just looked like animals. They looked like dinosaurs, which really wasn't what I wanted for this character. So I pivoted into a more dark fantasy direction. These sketches, more ogre and demon-like, were getting closer, but it wasn't until I sketched this up where I felt like I was really starting to get somewhere. These final designs I really do love, and it was through this creative process where I decided that each individual Transcended one should look very different from the next. These were once mortal Saurians transformed into eldritch servants, and I thought it would be really cool if they could retain some of their mortal physical attributes. So I imagine that this particular individual that you see in the film, when they were mortal, were probably a ceratopsian looking Saurian. I went through a very similar creative process designing my own version of Cthulhu a few years ago, and what I ended up with was this heavy-set behemoth. He stood tall and looked ancient and wise. I think what I love so much about my Transcended One design in comparison is that this character doesn't stand tall or look ancient or wise. This guy is hunched with a big head and a small body and a long, skinny, rat-like tail. It instead looks more like an enormous, mischievous and sadistic imp. And that's because the Transcended Ones are supposed to be the servants of the Great Elder Ones. Demigods, not gods themselves. If you would like to know more about the lore behind all of this stuff, the Fel, the Transcended Ones, the Forefathers, SAURIA as a whole, make sure to check out my SAURIA lore compendium videos as well. I created this film and the whole SAURIA series using a mix of 3D and 2D animation. All of the characters and props and even some of the sets are 3D models, animated in 3D with Blender. But all of the backdrops, the environments are 2D elements drawn in Photoshop. And then finally, like in shots like these, any extra details like the blood splatter are animated on top of the shots using more traditional frame-by-frame 2D animation. For this film in particular, I actually got to 3D model a few more things than just the characters. The cage that the Blue Song sit in is a 3D prop, as was a lot of the ritual sacrifice set. I also tried something new and created a collection of tree presets for this film. I essentially just drew like 10 or 12 different high quality swampy trees that I could easily drag and drop into the backdrops of each shot where I needed. I usually don't do this, and instead I tend to draw every single branch and every single tree and every single bush from scratch, which is very, very time consuming. This preset technique is very useful and it saved a lot of time, but I don't think I'm going to do this again. I don't like cutting corners like this. I'm very meticulous and this felt lazy. I'm sure no one else noticed this, but I personally, when I watch the film, can tell that the same 12 trees are being reused over and over again. Ivan Duch again created the soundtrack for this film, as he has done for all of SAURIA, and his work, as usual, was outstanding. I don't know what else to say, other than just please go check out his work, his YouTube, his Patreon, his whatever else. It'll all be linked down below. Ivan's score has elevated the series just so much, and his work is amazing. I think this film is awesome. What it does for SAURIA's world building is particularly great, and I'm not even talking about the exposition-heavy Forefather Fel dialogue. I'm talking about seeing the oppressed farmers, the ancient ruins, and seeing how all of the factions of SAURIA are affecting the wildlife of the land. Even though this film is so heavily influenced by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, to me it still feels incredibly unique. This Lovecraftian dinosaur horror story, this weird dark stone punk fantasy thing I've made, doesn't really remind me of anything else. It feels very fresh and very new.
No. This one finds our little lives ever so fascinating.
But I do have issues with Rise of the Decayed. I think it's probably the most flawed of the SAURIA trilogy. The monologue-heavy, H.P. Lovecraft-inspired structure I don't think translated as well as I'd like. It just comes across as a bit, I don't know, muddy, confusing. I think the twist that Ornithosera has been possessed since the attack and has been part of the Transcended One's game isn't as interesting as it ought to be, and I also provided the voices for all of the speaking characters again, not just in this film, but across the whole SAURIA series. I don't think my voice acting is bad at all. In SAURIA, I think it's pretty great. It's just that all of the characters kinda sound the same. Nah, my biggest issue with this film is that it's the finale and it ends on a straight up cliffhanger. Which brings me on to the final segment. This SAURIA animated series started off as just one film, Blood for Blood. A simple idea that I had. It was just going to be a fun standalone sword and sorcery dinosaur barbarian film. While I was making the film, however, I couldn't help myself. I couldn't help but flesh out the world, the lore, everything around this conflict. I eventually ended up writing 6 different SAURIA stories in total. Not 3, 6. I decided to focus on just the first 3 films after realising just how insane the workload was going to be for the whole 6-part series. The first 3 stories still painted a really rich picture of this savage primordial world I was creating, focusing on SAURIA's 3 main thematic pillars: war, wildlife, and witchcraft. After the first half was complete, I planned to look back and see if people liked it, see how well it did, and see how much I enjoyed making it, and would decide if I wanted to continue the series from there. And here I am. The first half is complete and I'm looking back. I love this world, and I really like the 3 sequel films I have written down. The main thing putting me off continuing work on SAURIA is, as you can probably tell, the insane amount of work it is. If you've been watching these behind the scenes videos, I think you get a glimpse of just how much goes into everything here. When I started work on this project, I genuinely thought these 3 films would take less than a year to make. But it has taken me closer to 3 years. I think just over 2.5 years. To put that into perspective, it took 2.5 years to make 3 SAURIA films. It only took me 1.5 years to make my whole Dinosauria series, which was 5 films. And I haven't been working less, I've been working a lot more. So, right now, if I'm completely honest with you guys, I'm imagining working for another, 2.5 years, 3 years, 5 or 6 years in total on the remaining 3 films in the SAURIA series, and I just don't want to do that at all. SAURIA may continue. Like I said, I do have fun making these, and I like this world, and I don't like the way it's left off. But if it does return, it won't be for a while. No, I'm in the mood to work on something a lot simpler right now. If you want to support me or show your support for this series, please check out my Patreon page. For just $5 you will gain access to high resolution photographs of the whole sketchbook I've been showing off in this video. The entire SAURIA sketchbook from start to finish is finally up and available for you guys to read. The whole thing. By supporting me on Patreon you'll also get to read any and all updates on my upcoming SAURIA animated series Volume 2 as well. Thank you all for watching, and a super special thank you to all of my top Patreon supporters on screen right now. Without all of you guys, I would not be able to do this at all. So, again, thank you.